They'll be doing a lovely talk on diabetes. At heart, keeping people with diabetes alive is all about data. Lana has been diabetic for 20 years, insulin using for a decade, and now writes technical documentation about time series data. Steve has been an open source developer for 20 years and has an uncontrollable urge to solve every interesting problem he comes with. Together, they have an interesting daft problem that they set out to investigate. Today, we get to hear what they discovered. So please welcome Lana and Steve.
So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are giving a presentation on today and pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to acknowledge that this land, which we benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nations.
1 in 20 Australians have diabetes, and in 2020 it was the 7th most common way to die. Isn't that depressing? Luckily, this talk isn't really about diabetes. That's for a few reasons. 1, because this is a technical conference, not a medical one, and 2, because neither of us are doctors.
What this talk is about is data. Data is, we think, inherently interesting, because if you only have enough of it, what you have is information. And we are lucky enough to be living in 2023, where we have these amazing mechanisms that can take in large quantities of raw data and turn it into really interesting pieces of information. And when you have enough information, especially when it's about yourself and the way your body works, you get to make decisions that can, in some cases, make a real material difference to your life. Things like, if I change this recipe in this way, will it make it easier or harder for my body to process? Should I drink a coffee immediately before or after working out, or wait till afterwards? Or even things like what brand of pasta or what bread is better for me than this other bread.
So in order to talk about the data and what information we can get out of it, we kind of need to give you a little bit of a primer. Now, we're both still not doctors, so please bear in mind that this is our understanding of diabetes based on being, in my case, a person who lives with it, or in Steve's case, someone who lives with someone who lives with it. So everyone's experience with chronic illness is different, and what works for me won't necessarily work for you, or your aunt, or your friend, or your cousin from Trinidad on Facebook. In this talk, we are going to touch on some mildly gross stuff, like bodily fluids, and we also do briefly mention eating disorders later on. So now is absolutely the time to head out if that is not your jam, and there's absolutely no judgment if you choose to head out.
So according to most things you read, there are 2 types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. But in reality, there's a whole lot more than that. And so it actually helps to think of it as a Gartner's magic quadrant of diabetes. So the 2 axes are whether you produce insulin and whether you are resistant to insulin. So if you have type 2, which generally produce insulin but can't really use it that well, we give them medication to reduce their resistance to insulin. And you have type 1, who can use any insulin they have, but they aren't producing it. So we give them store-bought insulin. But then as you age, things change. As people with diabetes get older, they generally produce less insulin and become more resistant. So we all sort of drift into the bottom left quadrant. That means that some type 2s will eventually need to take insulin, and some type 1s might need medication to lower their resistance to insulin. Even people who don't have diabetes tend to drift that way as they age, so they may or may not eventually meet the criteria to be considered actually diabetic. So what we want to point out at this stage is there are also a couple of in-between types, which sometimes get called type 1.5, and they have varying characteristics of both. Some look more like type 1 early on, and some look more like type 2 to start with, and then change to looking more like type 1. And so we tend to refer to people with diabetes not as type 1 or type 2, but as insulin requiring or non-insulin requiring.
So now we've got that bit out of the way, I'd like to give you a potted history of my own diagnoses. So I was first diagnosed at age 22 as a type 2, which surprised everyone, me included. And so I started taking a bunch of medication to lower my insulin resistance. After about 7 years of not really managing things very well, I had a specialist suggest that perhaps I was one of the in-between types called MODY, M-O-D-Y. So to get diagnosed as MODY, you need to do a bunch of genetic testing, and I went through all that over a period of a few years, and eventually I had an answer. The answer came back, wait for it, inconclusive. So my official diagnosis then became atypical diabetic, which isn't particularly useful to anyone. But the benefit of that was that I managed to switch from medication to insulin. Now, that might seem like a step backwards to go from a handful of pills each day to multiple daily injections, but I can tell you it changed my life. The plot twist to all this is that late last year, I had a, I lost my place. Late last year, I've been diabetic for a full 20 years at this point, and they decided to retest for a bunch of antibodies that they'd never previously tested me for. And I am now officially, dun dun dun, type 1. So I've now got the full set, basically. Insert face palm here, basically. Oh, it's me again. Let's get to the fun part, the data.
So, in the beginning, way before both of our times, there was peeing on a stick. That really just told you if your sugars were high enough that you might need to consider packing a bag to go to the hospital. Not really much more than that. Not much data there to really speak of, so let's move on.
When I was first diagnosed, and for many years I relied on the blood test machine. This is my current blood test machine, so I won't hand it around, but I'm sure you've all seen similar things. And the thing that goes along with the blood test machine is the paper logbook. You can still walk around into just about any chemist and ask for one of these. They'll give it to you for nothing. We've just lost our slides.
No,
there
I
it is,
fixed
it's
it.
back. So we did. We walked into my local chemist and we asked for a paper logbook and they gave us one. And I think we can probably hand that into the audience to pass around so people can take a closer look. So you literally test your blood a few times a day. It should be 6 to 8 times roughly on this schedule. Every time you do a test, you write the number down in your little book. But that's just 6 to 8 readings at points in time. You have no information about the trends at any moment. So depending on which book you get, and unfortunately this little book that's going around the room doesn't have one, but some of them actually had a little thing in the back where you could plot your graph for the day, which was kind of neat, handy. Of course, the whole writing it down in a little book is prone to some error. Say, for example, you pull out a 12.2, a very high number, first thing in the morning, and you're feeling a little bit grumpy about it, call it an 8.2, or just forget to write it down. No one's going to know, right? Right? Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it.
So when Lana first got her smartphone, one of the first apps she went looking for was a way to store her glucose numbers and to throw that little paper book in the bin, which is why we don't have her original one. The main one that she used was called Glucosio, which was open source. It still exists, although it looks a little abandoned. It was nothing really more than an app version of the paper book with the added benefit of some little graphs, but it didn't rock her world.
Then along came what they call a flash glucose monitoring system, and it did rock my world. It also costs nearly $200 a month. It's called the Freestyle Libre. It's made by a pharmaceutical company called Abbott. It's basically a sticky patch that you put on your body, and there are strict rules about where on your body you can put it, which I regularly flouted. The device has a little filament that sits under your skin, and it would mostly, but not always, stay put there for a full 14 days. The filament doesn't go deep enough to read glucose from your blood, so it actually reads from interstitial fluid. The sensor itself contains not much more than a chip, a small battery, and an NFC transmitter. So you hold your phone or a dedicated reader, a receiver, like this. That's available, by the way, at the low cost of about $180. So you can hold that up to the sensor on your body and it reads all the data that the sensor has stored, and it's up to about 8 hours. So the trick there is don't sleep in on a Sunday morning. because you'll lose all your data from late Saturday night.
Abbott produced an app to go with their sensor, imaginatively called the Freestyle Libre Link, and it's fine, I guess. It has a very pretty graph. However, Lana couldn't add any extra information to it, so if she did a blood test, she couldn't see that, and she had no way to track whether or not she'd eaten how many carbs and how much insulin she had. But the weirdest part about this app that it was sometimes rewrite history.
At first, I actually thought I was losing my mind. I'd scan, I'd see a reading of 8.4, then an hour later I'd look and my sugars hadn't gone above 7.9. And it actually took a whole lot of time and weirdness and Googling. And I actually worked out eventually that they have a proprietary, I've lost my spot again.
And patented.
They have a proprietary patented data smoothing algorithm that they use. So when you have a few past readings, the algorithm looks at those and then it smooths out all the peaks and troughs. It makes your graphs look less spiky, but it really actually just weirded me out. It felt like the app was telling me that numbers I'd gotten I'd never really actually gotten. So surely there had to be a way to read the data from the sensor and graph that directly without the algorithm being involved.
So from the Italian free software dimension came GLIMP. Now GLIMP was a bit of a revelation. It gave a reading and a giant red trend arrow. So you knew if you were heading up and down, on how quickly, and whether or not you need to panic. It also had the ability to let you type in your insulin data, and it would show you how long it was active for. Lana takes two different types of insulin, one that's long-acting, and kicks in an hour or so after she takes it, and hangs around eating up glucose for somewhere close to 24 hours. There's also short-acting, which kicks in after about 5 minutes, and hangs around for a few hours. And being able to track these things made a huge difference to being able to work out how much insulin and food she needed, and more importantly, when.
The problem with GLIMP is that it was just very Italian. Everything was in Italian. The instructions, the support, presumably the code comments. To get any kind of GLIMP support, I usually resorted to just browsing Reddit. It wasn't bad necessarily, it was just janky. So any sort of problem, and I would fairly quickly discover that I was all on my own. I was sort of swimming in this Italian diabetes world that I had no understanding of. So, for example, at one point, I started getting this random Java socket timeout error, sometimes for hours on end, so no readings for hours, just a timeout error. I never actually did work out what was causing that or how to fix it.
The second main thing GLIMP did, though, was it introduced Lana to the world of Night Scout. So some of you may have gone to Dana Lewis's keynote at LCA a few years ago, and so we're hoping that name isn't really new to you. But if it is, the basic rundown is a bunch of free software people got together and wrote a tool that allows you to gather glucose data from a number of different sources and send that on to a number of other different places. This is really useful if you have an insulin pump. So the idea is you take the data from your glucose monitoring system, use Night Scout to have a good hard think about it, and then send that information to your pump to dose you. Now, if you can do all that without human intervention, it's called a closed loop system. But Lana doesn't use an insulin pump, she has multiple daily injections. So to some extent, she had ignored Night Scout because it didn't seem particularly relevant. But all of a sudden, we had a bunch of interesting data and no real way to access it or do anything particularly useful with it. So when she started using GLIMP, one of the things she could do was upload it to Night Scout to get sensor readings in a database that lived on cloud software that we paid and controlled for and could, at least in theory, be accessed in a bunch of new and interesting ways, like having glucose data on a laptop or a watch.
Then Abbott had a brainwave. They had a new sensor, and it was going to be awesome. Except it wasn't going to work with my handheld reader, the one in the purple case that's in the room, and it's not going to work with GLIMP. And that meant that I couldn't get the data into Night Scout anymore. And by then, I was actually addicted to having the data on my watch. So we started to look for new options. The best option seemed to be Dexcom, which came in at a cost of about $350 a month, or almost double the cost of the Abbott one. I stuck with the older Abbott sensor for as long as I could, and as soon as they announced that it was dead, it was discontinued, we jumped into those expensive Dexcom waters. Shiny. This is the Dexcom G6. It's not a swish private business jet, even if it feels like it costs about the same amount sometimes. It's a complete continuous glucose monitoring system. So everything I had tried before the G6 was really only a partial solution. This was the real deal.
So the Dexcom has two main components: a sensor, which is the bit that goes under your skin and does the measuring, and a transmitter, which clips into the sensor on top and has a Bluetooth chip in it to talk to your phone. Our first question, of course, what's talking to which bit? And it turns out nobody's allowed to know that. We even went so far as to try and pry open a transmitter to have a look inside it, and all that got was both of us having cut up hands. What we think happens is the sensor reads more or less every 5 minutes and sends it to the transmitter, which stores it for some unknown period of time, although we have a theory it's about 3 hours. The phone then tries to handshake with the transmitter and authenticate with the code that the sensor's got. The transmitter auths, or doesn't, and completes that handshake, and the phone says, "Have you got any data for me?" If the phone and the transmitter connected successfully 5 minutes ago, that will be just one reading. But if they've been out of contact for whatever reason, it'll send whatever you have so you can get backfill data. Our best guess is it will backfill to about 3 hours, but not much more than that.
Of course, all this is driven by a phone, and that requires an app. And this is where we found my first problem. Dexcom support a super limited number of phones, and at the time I was using a cheap Chinese phone, so absolutely no dice there. In fact, if you want to use the Dexcom app, the proprietary Dexcom app on an Android at all, you need to have an older model Pixel or Samsung, or one of exactly 3 older LG models. You literally cannot even install the app on any other model phone. So if you want to, say, check it out before you throw $300 down on this, sorry, out of luck. Luckily, smart open source people have worked this one out too, and along came the catchily named
Extra Plus, for some reason. It brought with it a whole host of new and interesting problems. And data, so much data. Unfortunately, because it needs to do things that Google would rather you didn't, it's not available on the Play Store, or even through alternative installation sources like F-Droid. So you need to sideload it. Anyway, we got it installed, bought the first sensor, cried about a bank balance, and set about getting it going. And the first thing you notice about Xtrip is it has options. Lots and lots of options. And getting them right is not entirely trivial. We spent many hours just looking through the settings screen, fiddling with things.
So once I actually managed to pocket dial a new setting, it took me about half an hour. We were looking through the settings, we were Googling, we were searching for stuff. There's a search function in Xtrip to find settings. It took us, a good half an hour to work out how to turn it off again just through a pocket dial.
It also has some quirks. Like when you change sensors, it helps if you take the transmitter off and put it in the microwave for 10 minutes. For the Faraday cage effect, not to bombard it with radiation. That gets expensive. So then you take it out and put it in the new sensor. Little things like that make life at our house pretty exciting because we know how to party.
Yeah, you always check the microwave before you turn it on. Like all complex systems, that means that it also just does a lot of super interesting stuff. So things like being able to snooze my alarms, which my Dexcom app can't do. The Dexcom app, sorry, I've never actually installed it. It can send a text message to Steve with my location if I don't acknowledge an alarm within a set period of time. So it'll basically say, your girlfriend's at this GPS location, maybe go find her. That's also not a thing that Dexcom does. And it also does all sorts of neat calculations based on insulin and carbs. So it gives me an idea of how much insulin I should take to counteract that massive bowl of pasta I ate for dinner last night, or how many jelly beans I should consider having for a low. All of which Dexcom, you guessed it, does not do. Then it takes all that juicy data and uploads it to my Night Scout site where I can grab it, see it on my watch, on my desktop, or on any other fancy device that I might decide to try out in the future. Oh, there you go. To get things back to the data, I wanted to share some actual screenshots from the various apps that I've used, showing some of the issues we have with data in different systems.
So we don't have photos of Lana's original paper book, which probably tells you just how little she cared for it. But this is the sample data in the one that you've seen. It's not very interesting, but it's here just for completeness.
This is the only screenshot I apparently took of Glucosio, despite using it for at least a year or two. My main memory of the app is that it's very pink. We looked in the App Store for it, and it does seem to be dead. So we went to try and find out if it's still being developed, and it looks as though it's been pretty much abandoned. Blood test machines, including my current one, all have Bluetooth enabled, so they all actually come with their own proprietary apps. The one for this one is terrible. So I'm sort of assuming that the world's kind of moved on from needing an open source solution to the blood test machine.
So this is the proprietary Abbott app, the LibraLink. And on a good day, it would look like the graph on the left. But then there are the other days where there'd be gaps and weird persistent lows that weren't actually lows, like the one on the right. Those were usually caused by the sensor coming loose on Lana's skin and the little filament pulling out. In some cases, this could be a little painful. We experimented a lot with different tapes to hold those sensors on for the full 14 days.
This is the proprietary Dexcom app, which of course I can't install. So we asked my mum, who uses it, to send me some screenshots. Unfortunately, the app also has a security setting that means you can't screenshot it. So this is a cropped photograph of my mum holding her phone. You can see it has this weird teardrop here. So this arrow part points up or down, depending on whether you're heading up or down. So it sort of points up or down and moves during the day. In this shot, it's pointing to the right, which means her sugars are holding steady. So high, I might add, but steady.
And this is X-Strip, which on a good day would look like this on the left. You can see the blue dots are readings, the green dots being insulin on board, and the purple dots being a prediction based on readings, carbs, and insulin. And at the top of the screen is usually a calculation saying what it thinks Lana should do in terms of carbs or insulin. Sometimes exciting stuff happens, like this on the right, where it has a purple prediction line going up, saying, as well as the red prediction line going down. In this case, it's telling Lana to take insulin, but with a warning symbol, which is extra version of the shrug emoji, like,
So then you have days when you put a new sensor on, and your body kind of freaks out a little. You are essentially creating a little wound in your skin, and it actually takes a day or two for your body to get used to it being there. All of which means your readings go a little haywire for about 24 hours. So this one is from the Libre on the left, and you can see it's just a bit wild. The one on the right is X-Strip. And I mean, admittedly, I'm eating food and taking insulin and running around and doing all that stuff as well, but that data is noisy.
So when things get really exciting in X-Strip, you have readings like the one on the left with the double arrow down, which is basically eat all the sugar and do it fast. Or this one on the right, where you can see Lana has had quite the day, eating all the carbs and consequently injecting all of the insulin.
Cake is delicious.
So let's run through how things are currently working. We've broken this stuff down into timing because it gives you an idea of just how much work is involved in managing this.
So starting with readings. Readings happen more or less every 5 minutes. With my old phone, it was closer to 8. With my new phone, it's closer to 4. So the phone actually does make a difference in how frequent your readings are. Either way, it's around 250 to 300 readings a day, which is a far cry from the 6 to 8 blood tests I was doing when I was first diagnosed.
Night Scout polls X-Strip every few minutes and updates its database with any new data. So Lana's watch, desktop widget, browser plugins all then pull from Night Scout on their own schedules, and we haven't read the code for that, but most of them are probably around 5 minutes as well.
Insulin injections happen multiple times a day. I take long-acting morning and night at roughly the same time every day, although I can screw it up by an hour or two or forget completely like I did yesterday. and nothing terrible really happens. So short acting is more ad hoc. If I'm about to have a giant bowl of rice, I'll have an injection as I sit down to eat, and then maybe another one later on. Pasta and potatoes work differently, as does bread and simple sugars like lollies, cake, or chocolate. It's also important to take into account exercise. Some exercise sends me high while I'm doing it, some sends me low. All exercises send me low afterwards, so I usually need to make sure I'm within arm's length of some carbs after a workout. It's also important to note that other things can affect whether or not I need insulin as well. So it's not just food and exercise. Things like stress, your mood, the weather, weight loss and gain, incidental exercise like gardening or walking around the shops, and how much overall exercise, I'm going to say, that's how many times I've been to the gym this week, not just whether or not I'm there now. All those things can make a difference. And so then there's the dawn effect. One thing that human bodies do to wake us up is our liver says, oh, hi, and gives you a little hit of glucose. So if you have a working pancreas, you process that and you start feeling hungry and then you go and get breakfast. People with diabetes instead tend to wake up with high blood sugars regardless of what they've been eating or what readings they had overnight. And that means either living with the high numbers and skipping breakfast or having some insulin so that you can have a piece of toast.
We didn't test this, so brace yourself. Alarms happen more or less every day. During the day, you have a low alarm, which sounds like this. Oh, good.
Should we do that again?
Yeah, okay. And a high alarm, which sounds like this. If you've been in a talk after Lana's had lunch, you might have heard one of those already.
There's been at least a couple this week.
So the lows go off under 3.8 and the high alarms that go off over 8.0. At night, the alarm is quieter and calmer, but a little bit more insistent and less hilarious when it's 2 o'clock in the morning. But the range is also a little wider because we don't want to get woken up unless we really need to do something about it. I'll say Lana, because I don't usually wake up. So this is another bonus of Xtrip over the Dexcom app, because we have these complicated alarm settings with custom sounds and custom schedules.
So on to blood tests. They do still happen. They happen irregularly now, so not 6 to 8 times a day. I will usually do a few during the 2-hour startup window with a new sensor, but I'll also do one whenever I look at the number my sensor is giving me and think it just doesn't seem quite right. I mean, sometimes I'm the one who's wrong and it's fine, but other times it is a little bit inaccurate. So Xtrip allows me to calibrate based on blood test readings. So because my blood test machine is Bluetooth, I do a test, it sends it directly into Xtrip. Xtrip then says, do you want me to calibrate? I can say yes or no.
Or it may fail to send it into Xtrip.
Sometimes because my machine's a bit terrible, it fails to send it into Xtrip and I have to do it manually, which is complaint-worthy. Because interstitial fluid lags behind blood glucose measurements, Xtrip is actually smart enough to know that the blood test reading needs to be calibrated about 15 minutes into the future as well, which I think is really neat. In essence, I will always trust a blood test reading over a sensor reading if I'm unsure.
Sensors last 10 days. They take about 15 minutes to change over because they've got to go in the microwave. And then they need to warm up for 2 hours because I don't know. I guess Dexcom has reasons. So this means the time that you change the sensors creeps later and later in the day. And at some point, we'll let it go overnight and we'll just switch back in the mornings. And travel. Travel makes this even more hilarious.
I'm happy to hand this around, but I'm going to say, please don't open the package or break the package in any way. I'd like it to stay sterile. They're expensive. But basically, that whole plastic unit, including the packaging, gets thrown away, and that happens every 10 days. So we're up to transmitters. Transmitters last 90 days, and so far it's actually aligned really nicely to every 9th sensor. We have no doubt that we will screw this up at some point, and things are going to get even more exciting because transmitters are not designed to be taken out of the sensors while the sensor is attached to your body. It is possible, however, we've done it. Transmitters take a little longer to change over. They take up to about half an hour or so, and that's because we need to make sure it's operating correctly before we kick off the sensor. So we have to sit there and wait for it to report its battery voltages through Xstrip. Once we've seen the battery voltages, we can then kick off the transmitter, and we start again. Start the next 10 days.
And the thing on the longer schedule is probably the phone. Although Lana has bought exactly one new phone since using the Dexcom and Xstrip. And despite both our nerves about changing over between phones, it actually went really smoothly.
Who expected that? I also bought a new watch recently, and that was a whole lot less seamless. Despite the fact that I chose this watch specifically because it should have worked better with my setup, it turns out not to. And now I still regularly switch back to my old watch for exercise tracking because it actually gives me better glucose data while I'm working out. This one looks way prettier though. So you win some, you lose some, I guess.
Now, to the part we know you've all been waiting for, the actual data.
So my original Night Scout setup was a MongoDB database with a Heroku VM and hosting. Recently, Heroku ditched their free tier hosting and threatened to delete my data, so we decided to redo everything with Google Cloud Platform, which means that it remains free and everything is moved into one location, which is a bit more convenient. So when we shut down the old MongoDB database, we exported a bunch of my data, mostly because I work for a company that does time series databases, and having a bunch of time series data lying around could come in handy someday. So when we got accepted to do this talk, we thought now was probably the time to upload some of this historical data into a timescale database, run a few interesting queries, and maybe make some nice graphs, which sounds easy. We also thought it would be super cool if we could pull down some wellness data from my Garmin smartwatch and my smart bathroom scales and see if we could use the power of Postgres queries to get some interesting data. And the answer to all that was sort of.
We started with a whole bunch of CSV files with different columns, different data structures, different timestamps, you name it. Then we had the exciting stuff like trying to concatenate that data from Xstrip with the data from Glimp because the column names are different. And then the Garmin had extra rows into the table for weight, where the date was on a row all of its own with null fields, and then the time with the actual data was on the row underneath it. So then you had to manually move it around it. And CSV files are okay as a data source. You can throw them into a spreadsheet with a tiny bit of effort, and that might actually allow you to graph some numbers that are actually present or make some things based on those numbers. But if you want to query things, group them, do something else, you need something else, like a time series database. Converting from CSV to SQL is tricky at the best of times, since first you need to create a table and then ingest that data into the table. And SQL databases tend to be pretty persnickety about things like data formats. And where CSV just quotes it and says, that's fine, isn't it? So you can either transform the data as you ingest it, or you can edit the SQL statements in the file, which can get exciting. So we used SQLite, because it can directly read CSV files to create a table for you, and then you can dump that to print out the resulting SQL, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. But all the column types are text, which means then you can't query things properly. You've got to cast it, or you've got to alter the table to change the column type. Most notably, the date and time fields must be a timestamp TZ field for timescale to even convert a table to a hypertable. All in all, this took us about 3 weekends, more than a few work nights, and a whole lot of wine, and a whole lot of whining. And it's a bit of a wonder we're still talking to each other, really.
We did successfully put together a single working query, which we then squirted into Grafana and got a graph. So this graph shows my change in BMI over the course of 4 months or so while I was actively trying to lose some weight, and it plots it against my total weekly insulin usage. Essentially, the more insulin you take, the more weight you gain. So if you have insulin molecules running around in your body that aren't binding themselves to glucose, You will have a nice low blood glucose number to show your doctor, but the insulin is just busy storing itself as fat in case you need it later on. Now, remember I talked earlier about lying in your little paper book? People with diabetes are really prone to eating disorders, for hopefully obvious reasons. And there's a fairly well-known phenomenon that's sometimes called diabulimia. This is where people will allow their sugars to run high and not take insulin so that they lose weight. And if you're lying in your little book, you can get away with that for a little while. You will come unstuck, though, when you get certain other longer range blood tests done with your GP. So it's certainly not a good strategy, and I don't recommend it if you're considering it. So back to the graph. You can see where I was restricting my carb intake. So I was restricting my carb intake, lost my spot again, in order to restrict my insulin intake. So the insulin line is dropping. And that allowed me to lose weight. So my BMI is also dropping there. And my BMI actually dropped quite rapidly. It works surprisingly well. Then I decided I was happy with my weight where I was for the moment. I started adding back carbs, which meant I was having more insulin, and my weight loss started to level off. So the insulin comes back up and the weight loss levels out. So it's actually a really interesting graph to ponder, I think, anyway.
So to finish up, I think the main point we want to make in this talk is, wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow access all of this data that we collect about ourselves between 2 or 3 different devices, some of which even have the same brand names on them? They collect sleep data, heart rate data, nutrition data, weight data, glucose data, insulin data, and sorts of other things. Mostly, they're stored in a database that we can sort of export to CSV, but to maybe even try and get a small amount of historical data, like that simple graph, took literal hours of effort.
And we're smart people. We work on this kind of thing all the time, and we actually have some idea what we're talking about on a technical level. Imagine if people who had just been diagnosed had access to information like I do that lets them know which brand of rice is best for them to eat, or how to manage a walk in the park without keeling over halfway home because you forgot to bring jelly beans with you. If information wants to be free, someone should let the data know, because right now, that's locked up in jail.
Possibly permanently.
Thank you.
If you could answer,
Sorry?
if you could answer, I'll take this round.
Yeah, sure.
So, questions.
Do you know what's the reason for the transmitter to need to be replaced? So I can kind of get why the sensor might need to.
Battery life.
So it's not rechargeable.
It is not rechargeable, no. It lasts for 90 days, and then that's it.
And you can't pull it apart and...
We tried to pull it apart.
Glued.
It's glued.
Glued.
People have tried to extend them because they are quite expensive, but we're kind of privileged. So we just, after 90 days, we throw it in the bin and we take a new one and sigh about more single-use plastic, effectively.
And last one, as a side effect is that, is there any... Have you ever seen any sign of or are aware of anyone looking at making open source hardware for this?
No, just because it's a medical device.
I'd love it if they did.
Right.
I'd sign right up.
It's a medical device. There's strict legislation around medical devices, which is horrifying.
I noticed the Extrib interface is quite busy compared to the commercial software interface. I was just curious if you think there'd be potential for a simplified free software interface, or if you need all of that data in order to really tell what the sensor is doing and tell the difference between the different modes.
More data is more data.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yes, a more simplified interface could be nice, but to be honest, Extrib supports way more than just the G6. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's at least 5 or 6 different actual transmitters.
And various pumps and things as well.
Right.
One thing I will say though, and something I've heard from other people in the diabetes community who are not technical, is when you do first get your first CGM or your first monitor like this, the data is actually super overwhelming. So I love it, but that's at least partly because I'm a data nerd. Sometimes, and especially I think if you're less technically savvy, having that data coming at you is quite overwhelming. I think there's probably an argument for you could have a simplified interface that you could unsimplify perhaps over time. I love having all the information. Both of us constantly are checking on the status of my sensor and making sure that my transmitter's working correctly and all that kind of stuff. Personally, I love it, but I can absolutely see the argument for a less complicated interface. Yes.
We showed Xtrip to Lana's mother, and she's like, "That's nice, but nope, not doing that."
Heading to the back.
Just making it work for it.
Hi, more comment than question. Being another insulin-dependent diabetic in the room, with the pump, the transmitter is actually rechargeable, but the actual sensor has to get replaced every 7 days.
Yeah.
But you've got the constant graph. But I have the same problem as you. The Medtronic software does not work on my phone. I think it is literally only the Samsung and maybe a couple of other Android phones that actually let you use it.
Yeah.
Phone support is a massive thing, and I wish that Dexcom and other manufacturers actually took it more seriously. But I think it's time and data, time and money, really.
It used to be really hard because I'd have to upload the software through the CareLink thing, and at one point it would only work on Windows or OS, a Microsoft OS. I'd keep complaining and going, when are you getting the Linux version?
Cool. Any more questions? No, if we could have a final round of applause.